Following the end of the First World War, Germany was severely punished by the Allies as a consequence for their aggressive actions. The German Empire collapsed and a weak democracy was installed in its place. Due to severe economic and military repressions and restrictions, political extremists gained power in Germany. Far-right and far-left forces competed in various elections and attempted coups until the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s. But did it have to be like this? What if Germany, instead of falling to the far right, came under the control of the far left? Today we will ask, what if Germany became communist after World War I? The ideology of communism originates from the writings of a 19th century philosopher named Karl Marx. Marxism, as it was called, was an economic and political theory which pointed out flaws in the incumbent system of capitalism. These ideals were influential in creating socialism, which advocated shared ownership of the means of production and collectivization of different aspects of society, as well as communism, which rejects all notions of private ownership and mandates that the people should collectively control the production and distribution of all goods and services. When promoting the ideology, Marx desired the ideas to be spread and implemented in already industrial societies, such as the industrialized and capitalist states of the West, and Marx's home country of Germany. He didn't expect anything from Russia, then a poor agricultural society with feudalistic policies in place. Regardless, the first social state to form under Marx's ideas would later come there. With the unification of the German Empire in 1871, various workers' associations and parties would unify to become the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or the SPD. Being the only significant socialist party in Germany, many conservative elites and leaders, such as Otto von Bismarck, attempted to ban or suppress the party. The SPD survived these attempts and continued to push anti-monarchical and pro-socialist policies, while speaking of the ideals of class conflict to the people. In 1914, as the First World War began, the SPD showed their support of the war effort by voting in favor of war bonds requested by the government. Several SPD members who expressed anti-war sentiments were pressured into supporting the party's decision. In 1917, anti-war members of the SPD broke off and formed the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. Several strikes took place in armament factories across Germany, and the SPD supported the strike to keep radical communists from gaining leadership. In Russia, revolution had swept the nation and the Tsar was toppled from power. The next year, Germany's military situation evaporated, and the Allies called on Germany to make peace. Starting with a sailors' mutiny in Kiel and spreading across Germany's institutions, the November Revolution, or the German Revolution, had begun. Revolutionary forces composed of many socialist movements helped force the abdication of the German monarchy. With the fall of the German Empire, the Allies desired to lay a path for German democracy to emerge, but the SPD and the Communists held different ideals, with the SPD supporting a parliamentary democracy, while the Communists supported a Soviet-style council republic. Radical communists broke off and formed the Communist Party of Germany shortly after World War I ended, led by German socialists Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Mass protests and revolutionaries fighting one another spread through Germany. Despite this, the German revolutionaries had a deteriorating situation, as many German conservatives and far-right nationalists fought back against the revolution. A paramilitary known as the Freikorps put down the Spartacist uprising and assassinated both Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Far-right counter-revolutionaries conducted a brutal suppression of the communist movements throughout 1919. The end of the revolution came about with the creation of the Weimar Constitution and the official declaration of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic would suffer many problems, and the far-right leaders who defeated the revolution had retained many positions of power. The fractures created in the SPD and the left had not been resolved, and their political opponents demonized them in the eyes of the German people, especially through the stab-in-the-back myth, which blamed communists and various other groups for Germany's loss in World War I. Eventually, this power vacuum gave rise to the far-right Nazi Party and the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, resulting in the Second World War. What if that changed? What if Germany became communist after World War I instead of ultimately falling to the Nazis? Well, by itself, the German Revolution had little chance of succeeding. Lack of organization and cooperation made the revolutionary cause extremely decentralized. Apart from the existing party division, many of the Soviet republics had different interests, and the idea of them all uniting into a large communist Germany is rather unlikely. The scenario itself is rather implausible, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But how could the revolution play out differently? In 1913, the SPD chairman August Bebel died and was replaced by Friedrich Ebert, who was one of the most crucial figures in putting down the German Revolution. In this alternate timeline, Ebert dies early or simply isn't chosen to replace Bebel. Instead, he is replaced by Hugo Hasse, who was a future leader that was much more pro-socialist compared to the others. Under his leadership, the moderates failed to become a substantial force. Instead, socialists built a much more effective faction in the SPD, essentially making the party marked by rampant influence of radical socialism. So in this alternate timeline, the socialists under Liebknecht and Luxemburg make the decision to leave the party entirely and form the Communist Party of Germany around 1915 instead of 1919. Unlike the SPD, the Communists would show their active opposition to World War I. holding anti-war demonstrations, distributing propaganda, and forming a close relationship with independent unions. In order to accomplish this, the party would need a level of centralized leadership and no splinters or infighting. As the economy plummets and shortages become abundant, the starving civilians of Germany turn to the communists. In response, German leadership like Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg sent military forces to brutally put down any demonstrations. With the collapse of the German army in 1918, the Kiel Sailors' Mutiny still occurs. In the wake of this, the Communist Party comes out in support of the revolt. With communist delegations visiting German coastal cities, the Communists lead the call for the abdication of the German monarchy and an end to the war. Councils would be established across Germany by workers and police forces aligned with the Communists. Despite the tensions, the SPD or some other moderate party would still push for a parliamentary democracy with cooperation between liberals and conservatives, but the working class by now would grow largely dissatisfied with the SPD. Karl Liebknecht would denounce the system and declare the Free Socialist Republic of Germany, with revolutionary activity ramping up. A series of general strikes occur throughout Germany, and the police refuse to break them up. The communists arm workers and commit mass demonstrations against the government, which come 1919 escalate to violent insurrections across Hamburg, Bremen, Frankfurt, and Munich. Communist forces are initially disorganized, controlling various parts of Germany under different factions. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht go into hiding to avoid being assassinated as they were in our timeline, but serve as revolutionary propaganda instead. The Allied response is immediate, as the Treaty of Versailles is still in negotiations. The military restrictions of our timeline are temporarily exempt, giving the German government an opportunity to oppose the revolution. The SPD attempts a coordinated response, but the structure of the army is disorganized following World War I. Paramilitaries such as the Freikorps become the main force behind the counter-revolutionary German White movement. Just a few months later, the SPD, while attempting negotiations, is subjected to a coup by far-right militaristic forces. The Allied forces in the Rhineland under France, Belgium, the UK, and the US support the new regime for the sake of defeating the German revolutionaries. But the coup of the SPD only radicalizes the beliefs and opinions of the public and the revolution. The German Red Forces commit to partisan warfare in various cities, seizing control of key public buildings across industrial centers. Factories are occupied or subjected to bombing attacks, leaving the German whites mostly reliant on weapon and supply imports from the Allied countries. The Allied intervention suffered casualties as a result of these partisan attacks in various cities. The British occupied coastal Germany and various naval ports. French forces moved into western and southern Germany, however faced brutal resistance. French soldiers, many World War I veterans, opposed further military actions and when ignored, began a series of protests and mutinies. This prevents France from being able to fully mobilize and crush communists. The German whites attempt to stop revolutionary actions with all their resources. Brutal Freikorps units are sent and workers' movements are pacified through murders and atrocities. Ideological disagreements and communication errors mean the white forces have a significant difficulty working together, so the German White Army is just as impoverished and suffering as the Russian White Army of our timeline. Speaking of which, the Allies ramp up much of their support towards the intervention against Germany rather than in Russia. The British and French utilize tanks and other new weapons to destroy communication and supply lines. The Russian Bolsheviks come out in support of the German Revolution and call on German communists to join the war against Poland. The common view for this timeline is that communist German forces would unite to crush Poland from the west during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919. But this revolution would still have a much more decentralized system, and with a lack of military coordination, I doubt the Germans are going to help crush Poland, leaving Poland intact and independent like in our timeline. As the war stretched into the 1920s, public opinion in the West begins to shift against the intervention. Propaganda by the French and British governments attempt to get people on their side, but socialist parties begin to organize demonstrations. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson would attempt to send more American support to the German whites, but anti-war pressure from the public and Congress would be immense. Poland, having won their war with the Soviets, occupies much of Lower Silesia and eastern Prussia in order to protect Polish civilians. With the Civil War looking certain to end in revolutionary victory, the French would re-establish the kingdoms of Baden and Württemberg under their former monarchs. The French hope these new states will secure a buffer state against Germany. However, the monarchs have very little power in these new countries. Apart from this, the French set up a democratic government in the Rhineland, forming a French sphere of influence in the west of Germany, as well as annexing the Cold-Rich Saarland. Poland carves off small bits of eastern territory from Germany, and by 1922, the revolution has ended in a communist victory, much to the protest of conservative figures in the West. A larger and much more devastating Red Scare would occur in America, France, and Britain. German white forces evacuate to the remainder of East Prussia, where a dictatorship of nationalists is established, recognized by the Western powers as the true government of Germany. Meanwhile, the Free Socialist Republic of Germany would be affirmed as the victors of the Civil War. A meeting of Soviet councils known as the Congress of People's Deputies would instate Karl Liebknecht as General Secretary of the Communist Party and President of the German Republic. Despite the enthusiasm for the new government, Germany leaves the Civil War a profoundly weakened country. France and Britain cut off all trade links as Communist Germany refuses to recognize the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Due to war fatigue from the general population, as well as the outbreak of the deadly Spanish flu, the Allies faced the risk of revolutions in their own countries. The USSR failed to defeat Poland and now has to deal with the British and French, who are investing in and supporting Poland as a buffer against communism. With the success of the revolution, the communists would help the German government to formulate a new constitution. Specifically, Germany would be reformed off of a system of council communism. What that means is that rather than the party representing the will of the workers, various elected councils would hold the real power over respective regions. While both Germany and Russia have a close relationship, the issue of alliance becomes a contentious one in both countries. After coming to power, the communist government of Germany would nationalize banks and industry, and has workers run these institutions via democratic committees. They collectivized all fourth and largest states, abolished the remnants of Prussian aristocracy, and established a formal separation of church and state. The state would have control over the economy and could plan accordingly for industrial production. Private property is abolished, and the legal system would be restructured to fit the German state's new proletarian laws. Now, in our timeline, one of the crucial reasons behind Germany's successful industrialization and militarization was its abundant resources. But in this timeline, following the Civil War, the Rhineland, Saarland, and other industrial areas are either destroyed or in enemy hands, doing significant damage to Germany's ore, coal, and oil industries. And the question of post-war reparations is up in the air, with the other former Central Powers possibly being forced to accept them. In Germany, the socialist government, which is made up of mostly anti-militarists, will contribute much more resources towards scientific research rather than military buildup. I predict that under the socialist model, Germany would reform its council democracy to be more democratic, and attempt to lighten relations with the West. Britain and France would not be having it, though. Unlike the appeasement attitudes of our timeline, the Allies would enforce their support for anti-communist regimes. Britain likely still maintains a heavy naval presence in the North Sea, with excessive propaganda in the West against German communism. The rise of the British Labour Party, which we saw in our timeline, may be tainted by their stances during the German Civil War. Germany couldn't get away with openly rearming, leaving the Western Allies with a more significant military presence. I even see it possible that Britain and France secretly prop up far-right movements and parties in Germany, which is responded to by harsh crackdowns and the repressions on political adversaries. The German government maintains economic ties with the Soviet Union, abolishing tariffs between the two and exporting heavy machinery and automobiles to the USSR in exchange for grain. Now, something most people would expect is that in this timeline, after Lenin's death in 1924, Leon Trotsky would replace him instead of Joseph Stalin in the event of a revolution in Germany. The common position is that Trotsky was only robbed of leadership due to the isolation of Russia following the failure of World Revolution. So let's look in detail as to the reasons why Trotsky did not become leader of the USSR to determine whether or not he would be in this timeline. From 1922 to 1923, Vladimir Lenin dictated a document called Lenin's Testament, in which he proposed changes to the structure of government and criticized various political leaders. Of all these leaders, two of the most prominent were Stalin and Trotsky. First of all, contrary to popular belief, Lenin's testament was not kind to Trotsky. While Lenin admired his intelligence and leadership skills, he also called him hopelessly arrogant and was worried that he could alienate other members of the party. Therefore, Lenin advised for a future leader to be a unifying, compromising force who would keep the party together. In addition, the reason why Lenin's testament was not revealed until years later was because Trotsky was so detested by the majority of the Communist Party. He was seen as unfriendly, humorless, and joyless. Stalin was the one who had the most to lose from the testament, and even though many people hated Stalin, Trotsky was arguably hated more. So, if the German Revolution had succeeded and the new communist state had delivered millions of tons worth of aid to the USSR to ease its suffering, would Lenin's testament still be withheld? Well, probably yes, especially since Communist Germany wouldn't have a direct impact on the USSR until a few years later. Soviet politics have no reason to not be the same, and even though the revolution would give more credence to world revolution, Trotsky would probably not be able to capitalize on this or gain more allies. So Stalin would likely still succeed Trotsky in this timeline, but the USSR's impact on this timeline has indeed been changed. Unlike in our world, where the Soviet Union held enormous prestige and completely controlled the European communist movement through the Comintern, this is greatly reduced. Of course, the USSR is still admired, but is completely overshadowed by Germany, who in the short term are able to make much more success as a developed country. Germany is seen by the world as the true realization of socialism, whereas the USSR is a poor, backwards country whose democratic institutions are far weaker than that of Germany's. Now, this doesn't exactly mean Germany and the Soviet Union will grow apart. They still maintain a staunch alliance, but Germany is the leading partner in that alliance, due to the large amount of aid it sends to the USSR, much more than the Soviets trade with Germany. To counter this, the French aligned with several surrounding states like Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia. French military engineers expanded and upscaled the Maginot Line to build a defensive barrier against Germany, and in 1929, the stock market still crashes, beginning the Great Depression, like in our timeline. In this timeline, Germany and the USSR are exempt from this economic collapse, preventing the horrible situation we saw in our timeline. Italy, which had already turned fascist by this point, could build a much closer relations with the Allies, as a significant force against Germany. Since the Italian communists may be emboldened in this timeline by the success of Germany's revolution, Italy cracks down harder on leftist movements to prevent the spread of revolution, and a likely point of contention I can see between the two countries will be Austria. In 1934, Austria went through a brief civil war between communist and fascist forces. In this timeline, I can imagine Germany supplying the Austrian workers and paramilitaries receiving weapons. Though Germany itself wouldn't intervene out of pressure from the Western Allies, when the war escalates, Italy will likely intervene militarily in Austria to secure its independence and an alliance. Since Germany in this timeline has invested further into branches of science and nuclear fission, we may see some radical changes in that field. Famous physicists like Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard would be given more encouragement and funding towards much research, kicking off the atomic age much sooner than our timeline. This means that other nations have a higher chance of developing nuclear weapons earlier than we saw in our universe. Several German allies of our timeline, like Hungary and Romania, will instead work with the Western allies against the USSR and Germany. So is World War II likely? Yes. However, the victor is hard to tell. The military situation of the communist states could easily lead to an initial success, but very likely a total collapse in the end. The blitzkrieg tactics of our timeline may not even exist as we believe them to be. It's even possible for other countries like Japan to open up their own invasions of the USSR. The results of this timeline are difficult to predict. Will Germany and the USSR succeed in securing their dominance over Europe? Will the Western Allies be able to end the existence of communists once and for all? Or will an earlier, different Cold War begin? Comment what you guys think will happen down below, and what other video ideas you want to see. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.